Welcome, everybody. I'm your host, Lucian Fogoros, and the co-founder of IoT World. It's a pleasure to have you here today. As industrial cybersecurity threats continue to escalate, our mission is more crucial than ever. The topics of this event are focused on protecting the critical control system in manufacturing energy. And I'd like to take a moment to thank the speakers, you for joining us, and our sponsors, ABB, Fortinet, Keyfactor, and TX1 Networks. Your support makes this event possible. Throughout the day, you'll hear from leading experts addressing ICS cybersecurity challenges, and I encourage you to ask a lot of questions and make the most of this opportunity. Don't forget to follow us on LinkedIn and X for ongoing updates and insights. Thanks again for everybody for joining. I'd like to introduce Monish, who will moderate the first session of the day.
Thank you so much, Lucian. Hi, everybody. Greetings, whatever time of day it is where you are. My name is Manish Walther-Puri, and I'm really thrilled to be joined by some esteemed experts today. We're going to talk about securing legacy systems in the industrial setting and have a wide-ranging conversation with you. So I have three colleagues here, Debbie Lay from TX1, Thomas Menze from ARC, and Cam Cullen from Blastwave. So why don't I give them just a minute to introduce themselves, and then we'll get into it. Debbie.
Great. Good morning and happy to be here. Again, my name is Debbie Lay and I'm a principal sales engineer for TX1. I'm based out of Texas. I've been in cybersecurity from the IT side for 25 plus years. And in the last couple of years, I made the change over to OT and I'm excited to be here today.
Thanks, Thomas.
Okay. Yep. So Thomas Menze, good morning, everybody. So I'm consultant with ASE Advisory. My background is really process control systems. So I'm doing this now for 10 years with ASE. Before that, I was in the industry, and yeah, I'm looking forward to this to our discussion, and I think I can contribute some viewpoints from the from Europe, because I'm based in Europe, in Germany, close to the city of Düsseldorf. That's me.
All right. And Cam.
Hi, I'm Cam Cullen. I'm the Chief Marketing Officer at Blastwave. Actually started my career working in the Air Force and the National Security Agency protecting the government's critical systems. Spent most of my career doing networking and analytics, and now back into critical infrastructure protection now with Blastwave.
All right. Welcome, everyone. So let's start with some of the most common ideas around legacy systems is that by the very nature of them being old, they're difficult to secure, and people really struggle around dealing with legacy systems. We know that. That's fairly well established. What do you think are some of the biggest assumptions beyond that people make about the nature of legacy systems, in OT particularly?
Actually, I'll comment out because Debbie mentioned that she started out in the IT side and moved to OT. And I think people who come from the IT side think that legacy can just be upgraded or evolved to new stuff. And in OT, that is not the case at all. That's kind of the first misconception that many non-OT people have.
Yeah.
And what would you say? Yeah.
Yeah. And along with that is that, that the process to securing those is just to leave your hands off of it, right? And say, there's nothing we can do about it, even though the compliance is saying, hey, you've got to run next gen AV on a legacy system. It's not that easy to do. So understanding what solutions can really help with protecting those OT assets.
So if the legacy systems, and let's define this a bit, how do you think about a legacy system? Is there a time period? Is there a certain category? When you hear legacy system, we all kind of know what we're talking about, but how would you categorize those? Thomas, do you have a way that you think about it?
Yes, sure. I think the legacy systems are more and less installed and used with the life cycle of the plant. And that is maybe the biggest issue we are going to discuss here in Europe, because in many cases, there is no cybersecurity embedded from the start, because during the development phase of the legacy system, cybersecurity was not really a hot topic. And that is maybe the biggest challenge to overcome. We have to protect them from outside, and we have to comply with the new regulation. And that is sometimes really, really difficult.
Yeah, we'll come back around to that. Cam, Debbie, anything you want to add around how you define legacy system?
I think just that the with legacy systems, the expectation is that you will not get updates and that patches may or may not be able to happen because they're out of support. In some cases, maybe the vendor doesn't even exist anymore.
Okay, so with that reality, which is a difficult one, and moving to the present, organizations are adopting new systems today. In maybe 5 years, 10 years, probably 15 years, those new systems of today are going to be the legacy systems of tomorrow. So, loaded question here. Is that unavoidable? Is it just a reality that we're going to adopting a legacy system is unavoidable? Or is there a way to make sure that you don't adopt something that becomes a legacy system?
I think we have now these standards and guidelines. So if we add the right security measures over the life cycle of the control system, then we can avoid that this will be called a legacy system in future, because in most of our systems, there is a decent level of security already built in. And if we engineer the right security processes around this control system, then we can keep it for a long time up to date.
Okay, so Thomas, something I'm hearing from you, which is really crucial, I think, is something that characterizes a system that is not a legacy system is its ability to be dynamic, right? And keep up, which it cannot then, after it's been brought in, installed, deployed, be made dynamic. That has to be from the beginning, that it can keep pace because of the change.
I don't know. I mean, from my perspective, I think that's a wonderful concept, but I'm not sure it's practical in reality. Legacy change, there are some things that you're doing a process maybe that goes out of vogue and no one wants that anymore. And your plant is run on that and someone else is doing a new way and you're just not ready to take that adoption. So I think every OT operator should accept from the beginning, I'm probably going to have something in my network that's legacy just because times change. That there are new things coming online today that 5 years ago they could have never even comprehended as an option, thanks with AI, for example, or Gen AI, etc. So I don't think it's possible to plan that you will never have legacy in your network.
So this is good. Oh yeah, go ahead, Debbie.
I was just going to say, assuming that, I totally agree with Cam. Like that, we know that Microsoft is the baseline operating system, or Linux, on these operating, on the systems themselves. And so that life cycle is 3 to 5 years because we're used to IT environments and that mindset that every 3 to 5 years, we're doing refresh on our users or on our servers and those types of things. And that's not going to be the case in OT. It's just not. So their life cycle, as you've mentioned, 10, 15, 20 years. So knowing that, asset owner needs to say, okay, this will be at some point obsolete from an operating perspective. What are some of the other mitigating controls that I can start building into my network to assume that this is going to be a legacy system at some point?
Okay, so this is, now we're getting into it a bit. And as we do, I want to invite our audience, as they are, but I really want to invite you to ask questions. I'm going to do my best to monitor the chat and bring in those questions related to our conversation. This is not going to be one of those panels where we wait until the very end and then you get to ask questions. Please bring them in and I'll do my best to weave them in. Speaking of which, we have already some great questions and thoughts. One of them is, someone says, hello from someone who has a Windows 95 machine at work. And Cam, to support your point, we have an audience member who talks about hardware limitations and vendors going out of business. So there's this question around, even if our intent is to stay up to date, there's other external factors that create obsolescence. So with that, how do you ensure, and this is a question from the audience, just audience, please know I'm doing what I said I do. How do we ensure that is the right thing to do to purchase lifecycle support? Is that the not a mitigating control, but is that a really crucial part, an absolute necessity? And if so, how do you make that part of the decision-making process when you bring leadership in that we're getting this technology? And crucial part of this technology is this lifecycle support for software updates, firmware, asset management, all those pieces.
Well, I mean, I built products for 20 some odd years. And, when we launch a new product line, there comes a point at which one of your part vendors decides, I'm not going to supply this anymore, and I'm going to go to a new version. You always do it last time buys, and you're out scouring the marketplace to find as many as you can. So I think I'm not going to address the OT device necessarily side, because I think that's something where you're going to buy it and you're going to have a contract with someone who's going to give you a life cycle. I'm going to do this for 20 years, and that's all there is. And you have to either realize that when you hit the end of that, you have to update, or you're going to have to find a way to just survive on what you have, buy extras, spares, etc. But I think what's important from a security perspective, which is kind of what we're talking about here, you have to build into your network the ability to say, I know that this has an issue. How can I make sure that that issue does not get accessed or exploited by the world? So I think the whole concept that we'll have to grapple with in the OT side is, I know I'm going to have vulnerabilities. How can I manage that going forward? So that's kind of the premise that we have to operate on under cybersecurity.
Debbie, you mentioned, thanks, Cam. You mentioned mitigating controls. Can you give us one or two examples of mitigating controls that you either seem to be effective or that people should be thinking about as, the situation that Cam talks about comes up?
Yeah, I mean, definitely. One of those is a OT specific networking device that can sit in front of a single asset or a group of legacy assets and provide virtual patching capabilities. So understanding that with these legacy systems, that those vulnerabilities have already been exploited and they're out there on the wild. So you don't want those coming into your environment. So basically you're creating a shield, which we call a virtual patch, that says, even though we can't patch XP anymore, and we're leveraging some of that software on that operating system that has known exploited code on it, we can create a virtual patch and shield that device even though it can't be patched.
Got it. Okay.
Thomas. But I think we have to look into this topic from the operator point of view, and what we discussed so far is only the technical aspect. But let's go back to the regulation and directives. I think we should conduct a risk management to really estimate how important this legacy control system really is, and then we have to deploy these certain, let's say, security procedures to protect this device. But it is not only technology. We should not forget to train really the operators in the right behavior. We should train them on disaster recovery. So again, and that was my initial statement. So yes, maybe some of the control systems are at the end of their life cycle, but it doesn't mean they are completely insecure. We can add additional measures, additional processes to really protect them well. Of course, a completely new system is normally easier to protect than an outdated or legacy control system.
Okay, Thomas, you said a few things in there I think we're going to pull on. We'll definitely talk about people coming into the OT field and the workforce. If our audience would please take a look on the right, there is a poll that's open right now. Would love for you to just answer, how many years of experience do you have in OT? And there's just three options: less than 5, 5 to 15, more than 15. We would love to know that. And also we're going to discuss it a little bit more. Thomas, you said something that I think is a kind of controversial statement. And I like that. I made a similar statement and it was controversial. So I will invite that controversy here, which is newer systems are easier to secure. I think you said newer systems are easier to secure. We could, twist it a little bit and say newer systems are more secure. However we phrase it, the crux of it is that there is a difference. And I'm trying not to load the question here, but that's a charged statement, right? That newer systems are, by virtue of being newer, more secure. So Cam and Debbie, how do you assess that? Do you agree? Do you think that's a a fair way to look at it?
I'll let Debbie go first this time.
I don't know if they're more secure or not, because we don't know what is still lingering in that software or in the operating system itself. I think we have to assume that even though it's newer, and what makes it simpler is because there's more security solutions that would support that platform. So they have more options, I think, for securing it, and maybe that is the same thing. So there are more options if it's a newer operating system, more software that you can load on there from a security perspective. But by nature of the operating system itself, I think you still have to assume that there's going to be vulnerabilities, are going to get exploited. So how do you protect that asset based on its criticality, as Thomas said? And that, I think that's a key piece too, is to understand the asset's criticality within the organization.
Yeah, absolutely. And we'll come back around to that. Kim?
I mean, I think this comes down to the devil you know versus the one you don't. I think sometimes the good thing about a legacy device is you know what the problems are and can deal with them because they've been out there and proven. Obviously, there's always still a chance there's something lurking in there. But these new devices, they're going to have 0 days. They're going to have things that we didn't plan. They're using maybe new libraries, or even maybe they haven't done cybersecurity. All the cameras out there, the IP cameras that are on the internet are just riddled with vulnerabilities that get found all the time, and they're open and they're phone home, etc. So we have seen sometimes these new devices are actually far more vulnerable than the legacy devices because you don't know what you're getting. They haven't been proven. They don't have a lot of runtime. So, if you're a challenger and you want to use the new stuff, that's a great thing, but that's the risk management comment Thomas made is exactly the case. There's a risk management aspect you have to take of any device you put on your network.
So if we have newer systems that have more security options, thumbs up. However, they are apt to be more complex and with either newer code or newer devices about which we know less, which means we have a lower confidence in our understanding of them. Let's take the other side. So we're here talking about legacy systems. What does it mean that, I know those vulnerabilities. I know what those vulnerabilities are. I know how long they've been there. I know how they've been exploited. Does that create a greater sense of exposure? I think sometimes that's in there, but maybe it doesn't. Is there something that is valuable around, it sounds strange, but something valuable about having known exposure around a legacy system?
Well, I mean, I think if you look at it just from a holistic point of view, I think as an OT operator, you just have to accept that the OT devices you have vulnerabilities, regardless of whether they're new or old. So what is the best way that I can minimize the risk that those devices will get vulnerable, they'll become exploited, et cetera? So, this concept of a kind of a virtual air gap, which is I want my OT devices in the network to be able to talk to each other to keep the operation and the process controls going. How can I prevent people from getting from the outside into that network to exploit those vulnerabilities? If they can't find them, they can't see the devices, they can't exploit them. So there's this concept of, I need to make sure that people can't jump from my IT to my OT network. In fact, I saw one of the reports, it was, I think 50% of the vulnerabilities they're exploited in OT are lateral movements from IT. So first of all, you can't let that happen. And you have to find ways to make sure that the OT devices can only be accessed through secure connections into the network that are not vulnerable to things like phishing, which are a whole nother problem I think we'll talk about later with Gen AI. You've got to find a way to keep those devices not accessed from the rest of the world.
Right. Debbie, do you have thoughts you want to bring in here? We have a question in the audience about microsegmentation and OT network as a strategy for protecting legacy systems that might be related here.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. Understanding, the criticality of it, being able to virtually or physically isolate that system. We've talked about air gap. That's traditionally what we see is, hey, we're just going to take it off the network. And that's really not, for most customers, a viable solution for the legacy system. So doing that microsegmentation, being able to put a networking device in front of it, and say, we're only going to allow this certain communication to happen. That's one piece of it. And then adding to that virtual patch, you kind of ask about the known attacks. Does that help us? And absolutely, for legacy systems, we can build signatures now at that networking device that we know when these old vulnerabilities are trying to be exploited on these legacy systems, that we can prevent that from impacting that legacy system.
So let's talk about, I have some great questions coming in from the audience, and audience members, again, I encourage you to, there's a chat and a Q&A. If you want to put them in the Q&A, that makes my job a little easier, but I'll try and scroll through the chat. The other is you can vote on the questions. I would really love that. I'd love to see which questions you want to see answered because there's so many. So that would help prioritize. I do want to ask about, so legacy systems aren't just by themselves in OT. They're also being deployed next to and ostensibly trying to be integrated with remote assets and cloud platforms. How do you prioritize security when thinking about integration among those?
I think sometimes in security, people forget what they're trying to do. At the end of the day, OT networks are there to be operational. They're there to connect things. They're there to make a plant run. They're to keep water running and oil running. So the primary desired outcome is that these systems are connected. The secondary is that they're connected and can stay operational, which means don't let them be vulnerable to an attack. So I think we sometimes think about how things we have to prevent from working, but we also have to make sure that we remember we're trying to keep this working itself. So I think the goal is you want to connect these devices securely only with the things that they're supposed to talk to. So if you use that as the desired outcome, then you can start figuring out what's the way to protect them in that environment.
Right.
And here in Europe, I think we are quite familiar with legacy systems, especially in Eastern Europe. You will find some quite old plants, and quite old means maybe 30, 40 years old, and the control system is really a so-called legacy system. What we have done is really we developed here in Europe our NAMO open architecture concept. It is an additional communication layer outside the automation pyramid, which allow to connect, let's say, IIoT components to the automation system, but there's no direct access between the IIoT communication and the automation network. That means we can achieve efficiency increases in OT legacy systems by using IIoT components, but they're not directly connected and they cannot affect the automation itself. That is especially very important for safety systems. So you see, I think we are developing more and more workarounds regarding legacy system to really sustain the required level of security. Something like that is definitely possible.
So I want to ask now, moving forward in time, in a sense, from older to newer, and had a good question about clarification from the audience, like define newer. I think I'm using it in a very soft sense, something that is definitely in the last 5 years is what I would say in terms of time horizon that I'm thinking out, and then beyond a decade is thinking of legacy. But that's my sort of soft definition. But thank you for the question. I want to ask about new technology that we're seeing today and that we're starting to use today. It's 2024. We must talk about generative AI. And more importantly, I want to start with this. Do you, as a professional, just you as a person, as a professional, do you use generative AI in your work? And if so, how do you use it? And we're talking about industrial cybersecurity and legacy systems. So I promise I will connect this, but just give us a quick kind of run if you're using it, and if you are using it, an example.
Sure. I mean, I use it just from a business perspective to help with any type of marketing documents that I might be working on. Again, it's more of a boilerplate. It helps stimulate my thought process so that I can really take those thoughts that I really want to put on a piece of paper, but it really helps me from that boilerplating aspect. So I've used it that way professionally. Personally, I've used it as a travel agent. when I'm traveling. So yeah, I think there's a lot of good that can come from it. But as we know, anything good can produce something bad also, bad actions. So I think Cam had some points on that.
Good potential there. We'll talk about the perils in a minute. So I heard a thought partner or something to help you build momentum, really the core component, generative in terms of ideas, and then a more administrative task type one, the travel agent, which is coordinating, taking in several pieces of data and organizing in a way that sets up a decision for you. Okay. Thomas.
Yeah, of course. We are a market research company, and we are using generative AI quite often to really analyze big, let's say, big data to enhance for any, to monitor any anomalies or something like that. So this is part of our daily job. Yes.
Okay. And do you use it? I mean, I assume all of our organizations are at some point, but do you as an individual use it? How do you use it?
Yes, I've got a brand new AI computer here, so it allows to, let's say, analyze all my files, my data on the computer, and to combine that with some prompts I'm asking the machine. Yes, I personally use it for data analytics.
Got it. Okay, and Cam.
Yeah, so I've always believed that Google search is one of my superpowers, and AI, Gen AI, like using Gemini, for example, with Google, takes that to a new level because in search, and for you doing research on things, Google search doesn't always give you back coherent ideas. It gives you tons of links, whereas what Gen AI does is tries to put it into a cogent answer to the question that you asked, and then provide you links to the research that supports that. So I think from my perspective, it's a very good thought process, brainstorming, etc., and giving me good research around things that are happening. And it does help you sometimes if you're struggling for words when you're writing. It can be a good brainstorm partner in that process.
Okay, so I heard a few different use cases here, and we're going to bring this now into industrial cybersecurity. I heard brainstorming buddy, kind of editor advanced thesaurus, information retrieval. Those are tasks that we're relatively familiar with and have gotten advancements in those. And in that sense, it's evolutionary. And then there's a category where we mostly had people doing it, or we had to get to a very different place to automate aspects of it. That's coordination around the travel agent example that Debbie gave, and Thomas, some of the synthesis that you're talking about across vast data sets to put them together and find some non-obvious connections. So with that, that's just us as professionals, and that's us every day accessing this tool. In enterprises and on the system level, there's a lot more promise and a lot more peril. So help us understand how we should be thinking about generative AI, and to the earlier point, building the legacy systems of tomorrow. So what should we be thinking about? What should our audience be thinking about in terms of how this is going to show up in OT or how it's showing up today?
I think the first thing people have to recognize is that some of the things that we talked about, its writing capability, its research capability, those are things that are being used by offensive cybersecurity hackers to come after your network. So they're getting better phishing emails than they ever had. They can use it to do research to actually craft a more personalized phishing email. It knows your boss. It knows places you might have been because your social media posts, etc. So I think some of the attack vectors that maybe were clumsy or not, or harder to do and kind of reserved for expert hackers are now really accessible by anyone that has access to Gen AI. So I think the level of the barrier to entry for hacking has gone down drastically because of Gen AI.
Okay, thanks.
But on the other side, Gen AI can really analyze communication relationships, and maybe this helps you to enhance any monitoring and threat detection. So yes, Cam, I agree totally with you. But the good news is it's a powerful tool, and maybe it finds some, let's say, attacks in a very early stage.
So we have some point and counterpoint there. Debbie, I want to ask you about the travel agent example. How do you improve your confidence? How do you trust that it's reliable? And you've done it. You did all those tasks manually at some point or another, and or we have a human corollary for it. We knew that there was a person who did this. How do you transfer that trust to something that's more automated, or, to be specific, just missing the human component?
Yeah, I think from a personal standpoint, it's not as critical. So I'm kind of expecting that there might be some mistakes made in that on the key parts. If I'm just going back to my travel agent experience recently, on the key parts that I wanted to make sure that this was available and I could do this, I manually went out and still did the old school way of making sure, that I could do that particular event when I wanted to do that.
Got it. Okay.
It's kind of like setting priorities, right? What is really key to me, most important to validate, and then the rest is like, it's low hanging fruit for me.
There we go. So what I want to tease out here are two ideas. The first is that we have the acceleration of attacks and the increased velocity in the reconnaissance, and the ability, the way Cam put it, lowering the barriers to have higher quality attack plan, basically. Those two change the landscape. And then, Debbie, what you're talking about on the defender side is having a keen sense of where you have a risk tolerance for some mistakes.
Mm-hmm.
If it provides, we talked about the advanced thesaurus, right? Just for example, it provides a word that isn't totally accurate. The cost of that might not be as high as missing an alert, as engaging a control mechanism. So it seems like, and tell me if this is right, there's a gradation where we're willing to play around. We know that we have to innovate and try and fail, and it doesn't work. And we have some space where we can do that, and that's okay. And there's others where it feels absolutely not. Could you each briefly give us your no-go? Like, absolutely not. That should not be touched by anything that is not human. No, 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 no. So what is that no-go space for you? And if you can bifurcate it with and here's where I think we should experiment. Here's where we can try. And again, try and keep this in OT, industrial cybersecurity. You really want to focus on that. So who'd like to go first?
I'll take it. And just from my perspective is an unauthorized change, that you have some type of automation based off a security event that's going to automatically, shut down a component of some sort. Any type of change in the OT environment that's not authenticated by an actual human, I would be reluctant to put in place.
Yeah, I'll give one from my past, back in the old days when chemical plant was a customer of mine in a previous job. And they had an FDDI ring. Essentially, this was a very old time ago. And they were trying to update to new technology. And if the systems didn't get an update every 100 milliseconds, basically the plant would shut down because they thought it was going to explode because this was chemicals. Mm-hmm. So anything you put in your network that has the risk to violate the timers of safety systems is a no-go. So if something that could be affected, which, if you could DDoS a box and it would suddenly crash your whole plant, that's a no-go. That's for me.
I like what you're saying. Specificity, though, the timing, right? And so much it depends on that timing that's the thing that is.
Security implemented poorly introduces latency and performance problems. So if you don't put the right systems in, that's a problem.
Thomas?
Yeah, I think I'm absolutely in line with Cam. So my thinking was in the safety direction as well. If a safety system is really controlled by AI or whatever, that is a real no-go, because we have absolutely no experience how reliable that really is. And I think right now it's just too early to use AI in safety environments for safety functionality.
Let me push on that a little bit. My sense is that when these things happen, we don't jump to the the core use cases like an SI, safety instrumentation system or something, immediately it sort of graduates there. We step into it, and sometimes it's a slippery slope, and we slide down, and suddenly we're there. So what are the early warnings? What are the things before that we should be looking for? And another way to ask this is, does the introduction of Gen AI as a ubiquitous tool for decision-making in business and manufacturing and process and operations, ubiquitous tool, does it change how OT security solutions should be designed?
So so I'll kind of, on that particular note, my point is that anything that uses a password should be shot in the head and taken out the pasture, because Gen AI's ability to make phishing deadly is unbelievable. I think I saw a report like 1,265% increase in phishing emails since the introduction of ChatGPT, for example. I've seen reports that 90% of initial access to OT networks come from phishing attacks, most often, by the way, that come from the IT side of the house. So if you have a password and credentials that can be stolen, get rid of it as soon as you can.
Okay. So designing with a different frame of verification and authorization in mind.
I mean, you have everyone today, when they go to pay for their stuff at a store, you use biometrics, you use your phone, you use your mobile system. So being able to use the same thing that you use for your money, biometrics, your device, that's not a bad thing. Everyone carries their phones with them. So I don't want to have a password. I want to be what you have, what you know, what you are, those kind of things for the MFA. You can do that without having a password in the play now, for sure.
Okay. Debbie, what about your thoughts of, where Gen AI is moving and people are adopting it for all kinds of decision-making, not just personally, but, professionally and for enterprises at scale? How do security solutions need to be designed? They do need to be designed differently. How do they need to be designed differently? I'd love to draw on your background here working in IT. Actually, you've seen technology evolve and go, oh, that's a great idea. And then 2 years later go, that was a terrible idea. And, maybe we shouldn't have designed it that way.
Yeah, I think it can be used with security solutions. But again, just understanding and baselining how an OT asset communicates across the network, right? So I think that that's a great use case of, AI is to be able to, let me put a device in here, let me learn. And based off of that learning, here are some recommendations, going back to recommendations, but still human eyes to validate, are these the things that we want to put in place, and not just blindly accept those. I think also just, I know we're going to talk about this, but the workforce, right? To help, OT professionals get more proficient quicker, understand some of the nuances, and put some checks and balances there. I think that could be really helpful in a SOC type situation. So, but I haven't seen a lot of that conversation come up in my OT conversations. It's just, I think Thomas said, it's a way mature concept from where we are in OT today.
Yeah, I grew up on War Games as one of my classic computer movies. So having AI just decide by itself what's the best path may or may not be the best choice for people today.
Yeah,
I think we should always remember, the dependency of AI on fast amount of data, because that brings us really the challenging of securing this kind of data efficiently, especially in critical infrastructure. So if we have, let's say, some processes in place to really secure the data of the AI in an efficient way, that the decision-making process is reproducible, then it's fine. But before we are not sure to have these kind of security measures, then we should think twice before we are going to use it.
So let's talk a little bit about, and it brought up here in the conversation, is the workforce and people coming into OT. Debbie, you mentioned really helping people understand who are coming into it. So I put a poll in the function here, and before I do that, Cam, you had something that you had shared with us about a report that you saw recently. Would love to hear a little bit about that, and then I'll share the results of the poll.
Sure. The SANS released the 2024 ICS OT security report just earlier last week, and it basically reported that over 50% of the people in the OT security space have been in the industry or in the OT space specifically, less than 5 years, which is a significant. It's both an opportunity, but it's also a challenge.
Okay. Well, with that, we have that opportunity and challenge with us today. I am looking at the poll, and as of right now, remember there are 3 options: less than 5, 5 to 15 years, more than 15. For less than 5, it is 51%, and that's about right.
Yeah.
Okay, that's about what we're experiencing here, and we have nearly 100 responses there. I'll continue to monitor it, but I don't suspect that it's going to change very much. And then it's not quite half. It's about 21% that are 5 to 15 years. I know that's a strange range, 5 to 15, but it basically is, have you gotten into this recently, or have you been in it for quite a while? That's really the question that we're asking. So it's going to be a bit bimodal. And then a quarter of the folks who are here today, a little over a quarter of the attendees, have been in this field for more than 15 years. So help our newer colleagues. And by the way, I think I would put myself in that less than 5 years category for OT, just to make that accessible for the rest of you in the audience. I am continuing to learn and deepen my knowledge about this. What is most important to understand if you're new to OT about securing legacy systems? And let me put it to you this way. What takes the longest to learn? What is the most expensive to get wrong early on? So let's try and push ourselves, not for the obvious, like, okay, this thing's going to be here, but what are the things that you would move to the front and say, this takes 10 years, 15 years to learn, but if you can understand this in the first 5 years, that's really crucial and going to put you in a different place. Debbie, let's start with you.
Wow. It's a loaded question there. I think, from my perspective, just moving over, and I'm in that category of less than 5 years also, is just to understand that my IT mindset of how I thought to secure a network or an IT asset is not going to be the same for OT. There's just so many unique challenges around that OT environment, and to appreciate the fact that the asset owner and the asset operator, that system has been running for 10, 15, 20 years. They've never had a cybersecurity incident yet. And now you're coming in and you need to secure it, right? And so now you want to make a change in their environment to understand what is in it for them, because from their perspective, this asset hasn't gone down in 15 or 20 years, right? And so I think helping bridge that gap on those legacy systems for me is just a perception of when I'm going in to talk about security in the OT environment.
Are there parts of the IT mindset that you think are relevant, that are especially relevant? So let's assume that, you have to have a different mindset, but are there parts that you'd say that is still really valuable and in fact quite valuable here?
Yeah, I think just going back to the fundamentals of just designing a secure network from the ground up. And we see that in all the compliance regulations. They all talk about, zones and being able to segment that traditionally flat network that's out there today. And so I think fundamentally going back to the basics, and this is what we did before we even had security, right? We were connecting these networks together, right? And we had the whole concepts between firewalls and routers, and we were doing some levels of security there, who can talk to who. But fundamentally going back to some of those basics and architecting a good OT secure network.
Debbie, if I may, I think there's another aspect. This is really the diversification of skills. So the new professionals, they bring sometimes really a good mix between IT and OT. And this may maybe increase the understanding of the OT issues. And if you collaborate between experienced and new professionals, then there's maybe an exchange of these IT OT skills, and that could be very helpful.
Yeah, I was actually going to build. That was going to go with my answer. There's a question from Igor. No, that's good. Actually, there's a question from Igor on the chat about about sharing intelligence between companies. There is a organization called the ISACs, or the Information Sharing and Analysis Centers, for every industry in the OT space: water, manufacturing, oil and gas. They have these group of ISACs as part of a national ISAC council group, and then CISA also has the sector-specific responsibility and agencies who are responsible for the different sectors. So I think the key here is that everything that you're going through as a new individual, someone else in your organization or in the industry has probably went through it. And there are a lot of good resources. There's a guy named Mike Holcomb on YouTube. Check out his IT or OCS and ICS classes that he gives away for free on YouTube. So there's a lot of resources that you can learn from people who have been there and done that over the years.
Yeah, shout out to Mike here. Last name is Holcomb, Mike Holcomb. Really fantastic resources.
Absolutely great stuff.
Real gem.
Really good.
Yeah. Okay, look at all these. Yeah.
20 hours. 20 good hours.
Someone had a question here. How do you get into this space? And I was going to say there are plenty of resources out there, and Mike has a good handle on them. Let's talk a little bit. We've touched on it a bit, but let's get into it now around regulation and compliance. As we talk about the last 5 years, that is something that has evolved and changed. The idea that we regulate critical infrastructure that is predominated by OT and ICS, and having a different understanding, to your point, Debbie, of how process controls. There's a comment here in the chat of, look, you really need to understand what it's controlling, what happens. One of the differences if there is a computer that just a desktop or something that stops working, there's no smoke or fire. The OT system, there can be smoke and fire and explosions and loss of life and limb, like that can happen. So the governments have they've been aware of it, but have gotten the idea around regulating more. Let's talk about where it's a little early to say where it's effective, but where do you see it really shifting how people are making decisions, how organizations are making decisions around the choice of which systems to use for security and how much they should invest?
So just my input on this is I think regulations are both a wonderful starting point, but often used as a bad crutch. Oh, I checked all the items off on the checklist. I must be good. And NERC SIP is a great example of that in the power space, where you can say I'm NERC SIP compliant, but that doesn't mean you're secure. So I think part of the problem with regulations nowadays is the technology. Gen AI is changing so fast that the requirements don't always mean that you're going to be secure.
Okay, so let me rephrase that and see if others agree that regulation provides a sense of bounds for us, but adhering to those regulations in and of itself does not constitute being secure.
Yes.
Okay. Thomas, give us the perspective from Europe on this.
Yes, so I have a different perspective because I learned something here in Europe. So what we see after the Cyber Resilience Act or the NIS2 regulation, we get much more leadership commitment. So security becomes really an important topic. In the past, it was more handled by operations. Now it is really a leadership topic, and that means there is budget allocated. And I think that is the right or an important step forward to secure our OT environment, at least here in Europe.
So will you tell us more about how you've seen leaders think about those regulations? And, let's talk about NIS2 for
Yeah,
example. Maybe give our audience,
exactly.
we're from all over the
Yeah.
world. So if you could just give everyone a quick primer on NIS2.
So with NIS2, you have really, so leaders are personally responsible for the security processes, and the company and the leader itself can be fined if you're not comply. That means you have to develop a powerful employee training. You have to educate your people how to do the right things and do things right. And of course, you have to develop an incident response plan if something happens. So, and with that in mind, so really the leaders of the companies of the process related companies, they have now a different view because cybersecurity becomes more and more important for them, and this is really driven by the regulation and directives.
So that's interesting because it sounds like what you're saying is that the shape of the regulation is about personal responsibility, right? As an executive, they are being held responsible more. Is that fair?
Yeah, that's fair. And that is nothing unusual. For example, you mentioned several times explosions. So if you provide automation components into hazardous areas, that there is a leadership level of the company involved as well. So we just use this kind of methodology now with cybersecurity, and the leaders are pretty much aware what does it mean if something goes wrong with hazardous areas, and now they have really more responsibility in the area of cybersecurity. I think it was a good, let's say, motivation to bring cybersecurity, especially in the critical infrastructure, up to a new level.
So let's talk about the US for a moment in terms of responsibility around that, or where that falls right now in terms of regulatory enforcement. Debbie, Cam, could you give us the perspective here of how regulation is set up and what enforcement looks like and what sorts of carrots and sticks are being used?
Go ahead, Debbie. I'll let you go first.
Well, I mean, I talk to a lot of manufacturing companies, and while they all talk about adopting a framework, to provide them that baseline of what they're trying to do, there's not that heavier stick that says, if you don't do it, you are going to be fined. And that just doesn't happen that much here in the States. I said last year in 2023, when the SEC, so when you were a publicly traded company, the SEC created that K-8 filing that said if you have a cyber incident within a 4-day timeframe, you have to report. And so that one really had some teeth financially, because it's also your reputation, right? If you're a publicly traded company and you have to report, and we know that Clorox was one of the first ones that had to do that filing, and they went down that path. But as they, when we look at these regulations, right, really what financial impact is it going to have? It's more so in the States a reputation that I've seen. And even with the K-8, there's now exclusions. You can go out and click a link on the SEC and get an exclusion, so you don't have to disclose a cyber incident. So there's workarounds in that.
I'm hearing from both of these that it's not the, it's not the corporate or financial impact so much that is motivating a change in decision making. It's the human side of it, the perception, the perception of that individual and their accountability, and the perception of that organization and their brand.
And I think if you take that, there's a private sector aspect to this, and there's a public sector. And one of the reasons why things like water systems have been under attack so much, is because they have a lot of legacy, but also because they're very public. When they go down, it makes the news and it's a headline. Now that is a government, so to speak, operation that can be managed. However, there are thousands of water systems all over the country, all over the world, that to actually have someone to go inspect those and do the regulation enforcement is very difficult. So I think some of the challenges in the regulation space is there are just too many different types of systems, and the overhead to actually do true evaluations is too heavy for any regulatory organization. So they do need to make sure that the human side of this is taken into account, that people recognize water going down is bad for entire communities.
So with that core understanding of here are the critical services and critical infrastructure, there's a few questions coming in the chat I'm trying to put together. And that's, let's challenge ourselves to say, what is it? What is effective in regulation? What isn't, there's a question here, which is a good one. Isn't baseline regulation to meet minimum security frameworks better than under regulation or no regulation?
I think Debbie kind of hit it on the head when, the most effective thing out there is the SEC requirement for notification, because that is the biggest reputational damage to anything, whether you're public or private. Even though it's punitive and it's after the fact, right now, from my perspective, it feels like it's the most effective limitation on companies to not invest in cybersecurity, is they have to report out.
And going just beyond the report out, and we talked a little bit about reputation, but it's also about downstream consequences, not just from your reputation. If you take a look at Clorox, they were down for 3 weeks manually trying to process orders. When they were doing that, their products were getting off the shelves at the stores, right? So they're empty shelves. Those shelves were being filled by other products that are out there. And still 6 months after that initial threat, they still hadn't recouped all the shelf space in all the retailers because that was gone. So that not only the reputation, but the downstream effect to the business and to the stockholders.
I think that's a really crucial point, is something that we heard about earlier too, and has been a theme throughout here, is understanding not just from a security perspective, what does it take to be secure, but how does this organization think about this technology? How do they think about the systems needing to stay connected, like Cam was talking about, not just operational and secure, but connected? How does a business continue to run? What's the impact that they will have from this in a way that has a much longer tail? Losing that shelf space, where you put it, that's hard to recover, right? You can't just swap it in the next week. There's a lot of negotiation and money that's involved with guaranteeing and securing that shelf space. So if you are a provider and your supplier can't get there, then you say, I'm going to move on to somebody else. You have just a few minutes left, and I wanted to ask one more question, and then I would like to give you a minute or two to give some closing thoughts. My last question is, we haven't touched on some of the things that we often talk about in conversations around legacy systems and OT security, around remote access management, personnel or independent contractors accessing, integrating with cloud. The newer systems, you can't just say, okay, let's just focus on legacy systems. They're going to be integrated with cloud in some way, or we have a question around grid infrastructure. Is there any number of those kinds of areas that aren't, always, that are kind of perennial things that we struggle with? Which of those, and you know what they are, so here is my pointed question for you. Which of those do you think is most dangerous to ignore, or most dangerous to not really focus on? A lot of security professionals are trying to navigate around those. Which one would you say, look, this is the real thing? Especially, remember, we have a lot of our audience here who's new. You're going to hear a lot. You're new to this. You're going to hear a lot of these things. You're going to hear remote contractors. You're going to hear, this is the one you really need to focus on. Help them prioritize. So I realize that's a tough question, but you're experts. So where should they prioritize their attention?
So let me start. I would say, first of all, network segmentation between OT and IT networks, it's crucial. And then for all remote access activities, multi-factor authentication. These are my 2 recommendations.
To prioritize above all else. Okay, Cam?
I would say anytime you're connecting 2 segments or 2 devices or 2 people, that's the interface that you should focus on securing the most. especially if you don't know what's on one side of that connection.
Yeah.
Love that you said two people. Sometimes people forget that people are involved in security and technology. Debbie.
Yeah, I think, just adding to it, it's important to make sure that the communication that's happening within OT, you have to assume if that asset gets compromised, how can it proliferate to the other areas within my OT environment? So doing that segmentation that we talked about, making sure that if this asset is compromised, what can it do? And I think also just defense in depth, even if it's not the network, if I have a vendor coming in to your location to do upgrades and updates, once they have physical access to that OT asset, how are you protecting that?
Wonderful. Thank you. So we have just less than a minute. I want to give you each a very brief opportunity to close out with either what you think is I think we're actually probably right at time. It just turned. So that was a good note for us to end on, a really solid note. Thank you so much for sharing with us your expertise, your perspectives, your insights, and most importantly, your hard-earned lessons. And audience, thank you for your questions. We had a lot, and I hope you felt like you got them answered. And we have a wonderful day ahead. Thank you again. Enjoy the next panel.